Probably not.
No.
Because you don't have Netflix. You've already given up on social media. Not really.
Good afternoon.
We are today with, you want us to pronounce the name or
You
should we
first,
pronounce it together?
I wait to mess
Okay,
it up.
we're going to correct it. So we're on today with Nadjeschda Taranczewski.
Yeah, Taranczewski.
I think your pronunciation was better than mine.
She
actually.
gave a thumbs up, Andy.
To you, so you won that. So we're going to have her on, and we're going to discuss intergenerational trauma because we've had a lot of guests on recently with the same theme, which is just, it wasn't planned that way. But 2 days ago, we had on Peter Zuiderveld, and his mother was basically traumatized because she was in the Dutch resistance during the Second World War. And we had on Jessica de Vries, whose mother was in the concentration camps. All right. Yeah. So was she in the concentration? Her mother was in the concentration. So it gets so confusing because I actually put the wrong details on for Nadia. Yeah. So it was not Nadia's mother because that would make Nadia far older than she actually is. It was her grandmother. And we're going to have her on for the hour discussing that. So we're going to do that on
a wonderful chaos.
That it is. Nadia is coming on to discuss a topic that isn't necessarily totally connected to what she's doing, although it's not separate from what she's doing, but it isn't necessarily. So she volunteered to discuss this because I said I'd love to have an interesting topic that we could engage on the subject.
And this is an interesting topic.
Yeah. It was an interesting topic. She, just for those who followed our podcast and our broadcast from before, she works with Peter Koenig, who did
We've already had here.
We've already had. Actually, I saw today that he has the most viewed YouTube video that we've produced out of the 100 some odd videos.
Really?
Yeah, it's been viewed a few hundred times.
Did I cry?
You did. You did.
That's why.
Of course, we know your tears will always get ratings up. So. And they're doing a course together, which you're part of actually at this moment, which is also great with Conscious You. But we'll maybe touch on that, but we're going to discuss intergenerational trauma. And there's this theme or this topic is something that I've, how would I describe it? It's one of those topics that if you haven't experienced it, then you have to go very deep in yourself to see, wow, where does that touch me? Where do I identify with that? Where can I see that is something that would have impacted me? And what I noticed is that they're like on the highest level, they always say whatever our parents weren't able to heal in themselves is that they pass on to their kids.
Yeah.
And when I think of big trauma, then that trauma obviously is going to be passed down generation after generation in subtle ways. And I always think on a funny story, that simple story that it isn't the trauma side, but it's where there was this family and they're making a ham and the woman cuts off the end of the ham and puts it in the dish and cooks it. And they did that generation after generation. And then the daughter says, why do you cut off the end of the ham when you put that into the oven? And the mother looks at her daughter and says, I have no idea. We got to call grandma to ask. So they call grandma and she said, yeah, we cut off that piece because the pan was never big enough to fit it in. So the whole idea is that like, it's just these things that are on an unconscious level that we pass through generation after generation. And then there is a moment in time where everyone gets to heal part of themselves and not pass it on to the next generation. And it's not easy because I think on all of our shows, we touch on subjects which are kind of relevant to making peace with like your parents, setting boundaries, comfortable with no, having compassion for yourself, self-love. So all of those topics bundled together are part of the journey to making peace with that trauma, as far as I've experienced in my own life, working with people. And it's on such a deep level often at times, it's hard for me as a coach to work with it. If someone's a high achiever, it's really easy to work with them. But when you see intergenerational trauma, there's a level at which it's touching the individual on this sort of very subtle, almost subconscious level where it often requires a lot of deep work. That's what my experience has been there. So with that setup, is there anything you have to share? Because I went a little bit into the topic and didn't connect with you to see where you were at today.
I'm loving where I'm at.
Oh, that's always good.
I think through working with Nadja and with you and this podcast, I kind of discovered with the reclamation work, right?
Yeah.
So if you say I am a narcissist, for example,
yeah,
I've been trying to connect to it, and then it hit me yesterday after you gave me a bit of a hard time on the show, that where in my life have I had that experience, even if it's 1%?
Yeah.
And in that way, I can never say, I can actually just welcome everything.
Yeah.
That anyone will ever say to me from this point forth.
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
I think there's a lot of Eastern philosophies that will say we are everything and everything is us, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We contain everything.
Yeah. So when someone tells me a story, that's why it's always hard, because when we'll get Nadia on in a second, when Nadia shares a story with me, I'm often looking and saying, where is it touching me on a level where I feel it in my system, not where I logically understand it.
Yeah.
And what I find is that some places where people go are so hard for me to let in my system that I even feel like I throw up. I don't know if you've seen when we do deep work, I'll throw up a lot.
I've heard of you doing that, but I've never seen you.
Yeah, we did it when we worked together. When we were doing the breath work, I threw up.
You threw up on that day?
Yeah, I threw up on that day. And it's like because I let it in my system. It's like, like I need to purge it out of my system. That's how I've experienced it.
I get sick.
Yeah. So, speaking of puking and throwing up and getting sick, I think is a perfect opportunity
to bring Nadia
on the show.
Hi guys. Hey. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me.
You're the first guest that I said we're booking 2 shows before we did even the first.
So Andy doesn't actually know what he said yes to, is what he's trying to say.
I knew what I was saying yes to.
That's okay. We'll find our way. I was actually already taking notes while the 2 of you were talking, because there are already 4 topics that I think we could connect this to. So
when we spoke, we had a 5-minute conversation, and Nadia was so eloquent. She was stating things in ways that were very interesting and clear. And I thought, wow, okay, we could easily do 2 shows on any topic she wanted. Yes.
I know this show is being broadcasted on different platforms today. So just to say, if anyone wants to put comments, you need to go to our YouTube or Facebook page, A Wonderful Chaos.
Yeah. So how was my introduction? Is there anything you saw in it that you'd say, you don't necessarily think that was phrased, or you would see it differently, or how was it for you?
Well, I thought there was already a lot of richness in what the 2 of you were discussing in the first 5 minutes. The one thing that I would disagree with is that my job doesn't necessarily directly have anything to do with intergenerational trauma. I would actually say it's the only reason for doing what I'm doing. Yeah, so in many ways, and I know given your previous interview partners, you've already stabbed at many different directions at this, ripe topic of intergenerational trauma. And in my family, I realized that in many ways, I think trauma is a bit like a heavy stone that you drop into a quiet lake, right? And suddenly you see these ripple effects of just having moved a few molecules of water. Like, you don't need to have a giant storm in order to create a massive effect. And that's, for me, a good image for intergenerational trauma, because it just keeps on going and going and going and going. And my decision to do what I do professionally was very much based on realizing that I wanted to stop this pattern, right? That I wanted to stop the ripple effect from just continuing to replicate throughout this lake of that I think is humanity. It's not just my family, it's really humanity. So my big passion has become to build what I call conscious tribes, to build collectives of people that actually focus on, doing inner work, that build resilience by seeing a bigger picture and realizing they're connected to something that isn't just, them and their own story, but sort of the bigger picture of humanity and the planet. that actually do connect deeply to people in their life, and that whether that be at work or in their personal lives, and who apply conscious rituals, because I think it's very easy for us as humanity to slide back into bad patterns because they're simple in many ways. So how do we keep something that is more productive, more healthy alive? So so conscious tribes and intergenerational trauma, there's a very direct link for me.
Yeah. When you were talking about, first of all, when you talked about the pebble in the lake, immediately I had a very visceral reaction to it, because what I saw is that, of course, as the pebble moves out, or as the waves move out, they get smaller, but they're still rippling. And what I think is fascinating is that in your case, we're talking about, your grandfather and your grandfather was in the concentration, and the grandmother was in the work camp. So that trauma was a massive trauma to the family. And then from there, of course, it goes to your mother. And then from there, then you have the experience of whatever trauma wasn't addressed within the family. How was it for you and where did you sort of see in your life, you're like, wow, that's where I'm seeing how it's coming in me? And like, how did that look? How did you discover that?
So maybe to give a little bit of historical context around this, right? So as you were struggling in the beginning with my name, Nadjeschda Taranczewski, which Bambos, you pronounce it beautifully. You can already see that even though I'm German, there's clearly an Eastern European influence there. So my grandfather on my dad's side was Russian, my grandmother was Polish, and on my mom's side, they've been German for a number of generations back. And in my particular family history, I would say both sides actually experienced trauma in their own way, and that created, if you want, a perfect storm in my life. So the more obvious trauma was on my dad's side, because my grandfather, who was Russian, was actually thrown into a concentration camp, not for being a Jew like so many, but rather for what the Nazis felt was an interesting access into the Eastern European community in Paris, because he's living in Paris at the time. He was a journalist, and apparently the Nazis felt that he could access information and sort of key players in that community through his position with that community. And since he wasn't ready to collaborate very quickly with them, they increased pressure until they went to, I suppose, the last resort, and threw him into a concentration camp, and where he was subjected to all the lovely things that they did with people in concentration camps, like pulling teeth and pulling nails and those kind of things. So my grandfather actually did crack, and he ended up spending the last, I think, 2 or 3 years of the war in Paris working as an informant for the Germans. So there was sort of the double whammy there, for on the one hand having been victimized, but at the same time also guilt and shame, because he did in the end work for the enemy. At the same time, my grandmother, who was Polish, was taken by the Germans in Poland, in Warsaw, thrown into a work camp. And then, as the story goes, they went to the camp, the Germans went to the camp and sort of selected what they deemed to be the most beautiful women in the camp to be forced prostitutes for German officers. So she was taken from the work camp and ended up living the entire duration of the war with a German officer in Berlin, with whom she also then ended up having a child. And here again, you have this very interesting and combustible mix of being a victim, but also being a collaborator. Right. So for those two people, as you can imagine, after the war was done, it was also very clear that there was no going back to either of their respective countries of origin, because they would have been executed right away. So they ended up staying in the land of the perpetrators, because that was really the only safe space they could reach. And that's where they ended up having their children and raising my dad and my aunts. At the same time, we had the German side of the family, and my German side of the family is, I actually do believe then that they weren't particularly active Nazis, But at the same time, they were not in the resistance either. So they did what most Germans did during the Second World War, which was to keep their heads down, sort of pretend what was happening wasn't really happening, and hoping this would be over sometime soon. And when it was finally over, then to be confronted with the collective guilt of having been part of this machinery in some unsubstantial form, because they were, of course, part of the masses of people who didn't stand up, who didn't say enough, who didn't speak up at a time when it would have been possible to stop this train. So the ripple effects then in my life showed up in such a way that I was confronted with a system of silence on my mom's side of the family, right, where everybody avoided talking about the subject matter, because I don't think they ever found language around their role, their guilt, the shame connected to all of that. And then on my dad's side of the family, they didn't so much really process in a healthy way the experiences that they had made during the Second World War and with the Nazis, but at the same time, it was still part of a constant narrative. So, for example, I know that my dad, as a 13-year-old, was asked by his father to write down his experiences in the concentration camp, including all the torture, because they were still trying to get reparation, is that what you would call it?
Yeah, reparation.
Yeah, from the German government for the hardship that he had endured. Same with my grandmother, but of course women's experiences didn't really count for anything at all. And even my grandfather's request, though, was denied. So there was this complete hopelessness and helplessness and feeling of disempowerment. And the trauma they had endured, they basically drowned in alcohol and violence, right? So the ripples of substance abuse, the ripples of trying to numb a system that was still in a constant state of overwhelm, the helpless attempts to self-regulate, I guess, by kicking the dog, which then was my dad and his sisters. Yeah, that was the violence that he was exposed to, and in many ways that continued to shape the family that I grew up in, that he was the head of. Right?
Wow. And your grandma, she had this child with the soldier. And who was that? One of your grandparents, or I lost the...
Yeah, so my grandparents' stories is a bit crazy. So my grandmother lived with the German officer, had his child. While she lived in Berlin, she also connected to the Eastern European community that was quite strong in Berlin, right? Because before the war, people just lived wherever they lived, right? The concept of borders as such wasn't as established as it is today. And so when my grandfather, who was then already working as an informant for the Nazis, was sent to Berlin to spy within the Eastern European community, he apparently ran into my grandmother at a ball, and they fell in love with each other at that ball. And I don't quite know how they managed to stay in contact, because he went back to Paris and she continued to live in Germany, in Berlin, with this German officer. But they managed to stay in touch and somehow had made this pact that if and when the war was over, which was already tangible at that point, they would meet in West Germany in order to be in a zone that they would anticipate would be occupied by the Americans or British or French, but not by the Russians. And that's what they ended up doing, right? So my grandfather came from Paris, my grandmother took her daughter from the German officer and fled from Berlin to Wiesbaden. And that's where they ended up meeting. It's a town next to Frankfurt. And that's where they then started their own family. But
I feel like I've just seen a movie.
Yeah.
As you talk, I'm like seeing the whole film in my head.
My whole body is vibrating. Like,
yeah,
I'm feeling everything.
Yeah.
How like when you speak, Nadja, it feels that you're very detached, or that you've really worked through it. And I don't see you a person that's avoiding anything, but more as a person that's worked through it, and you're just speaking with ease. But I can't help when the words are entering me. It's like, oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's It's probably a little bit of a combination of both, right? I realize I can drop into a space in myself where I can feel this incredibly deeply, and where I have a lot of pain still but more on behalf of my grandmother in particular and what she has been through, including sort of what my grandparents, there was so much also inability to really express in language what they had experienced on all sides, right? But what I've understood from my dad is that even when the Germans had lost the war and my grandmother was fleeing to the western part of Germany, she encountered a troop of Russians, and to the best of my sort of piecing together the puzzle, she was raped multiple times on her path even out to safety, right? So I can connect with that, but I think within my own system, I have come to a place of integration now. So it's not something that brings up this well of emotions that I can't handle anymore. But I'm very cognizant that it has been a huge shaping influence in my life and has become the driving force for what I do today, because I really do feel that part of my path is to help, however small it might be, a piece of the puzzle of creating enough consciousness and connection to the body on the planet that people will not create another Holocaust, not create more of that kind of suffering and disease.
Did you ever have a chance to meet your grandparents?
I did. So my grandfather, the Russian grandfather, died the year I was born, and so actually did my German grandfather. So my grandfathers are very sort of abstract, nearly mythical figures in my life. My grandmothers were alive for longer, but I think with both of them, I sort of missed the window of opportunity in my life where I began to be interested enough in the subject matter on a more conscious level to really have a deep conversation with either of them about it. So most of what I know is hearsay from my parents, my aunts and uncles, then trying to piece that together and make sense of it in my own way. But, I also, because you said that it sounds like a movie, and it kind of does. And I sometimes think, if you then piece that together with my wife's story, because she's a Polish Jew, and of course most of her family was terminated by the Nazis in camps, and then how our lifelines meandered across Europe, really, to then find that one point of connection where our paths merged, right? I always think one day when I have loads of time, I'm going to write a script or something about this, or maybe together with her, because it really is kind of crazy. And at the same time, it's the normal story of families in Europe who survived that period.
Yeah.
How did it play out? I can hear my echo.
Yeah, it goes away if you keep talking.
How did it play out as you were growing up, interacting with your parents? Like, what were the things which back then you might have thought it was normal, but where you are today, you're like, oh wow, that actually happened?
I would say that's a good question, right? Because I think a lot of those pieces I'm only beginning to understand now, because as you grow up as a child, and you both know that obviously, whatever environment you grow up in, that's just normal. That's just how it is, right? So I didn't question very much how my parents' behavior or they failed, the marriage that they didn't continue after my age of 6. That's when they separated. How that might have been influenced by any of the stuff before them. I had no understanding of that. It just was as it was. Looking back, I can say that in my dad's side of the family, there's a serious issue around substance abuse, especially in respect to alcohol, and how that was used to numb emotions, to deal with overwhelm in life, to just help them not feel so much. And I know that I went through, a phase of a lot of judgment around that. And it became only more apparent in the last 5 years, I would say, to how much there was actually an attempt of self-medication. And that doesn't make it great, and it doesn't take away the pain that caused for, me and my brother, for example, but it makes it more understandable in a way. And with my mom, I felt I had a very open and quite conscious relationship with her from an early age on. But I would say that there was a little bit of a numbing in me around not even really wanting to know so much, right? So in some ways, I would say one of my coping mechanisms of dealing with the guilt of the following generations of Germans that was for me very, very present was that it was always more easy to identify with my Eastern European background than my German background, because that's where I could comfortably be, the victim versus sort of the shady dealings of my German family that I didn't quite understand, but also didn't really want to know about, right? So that's one way that it showed up in my life.
Yeah, I could imagine that you would gravitate towards the thing that where less shame existed.
Yeah.
I can recognize that. I mean, my first name was Charles, and in Cyprus, the British colonized the Cypriots, so I avoided using the name Charles for a very long time. It's only in the last year that I found peace with it. But I was really bullied, and that name for me was like, fuck, survival. Yeah. So
it's like being in bed with the enemy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm experiencing quite a hard time being present with my body. Like I literally, it's a lot to take in. I didn't expect this, but and at the same time, it's really, I feel very grateful how, that you're sharing this with us on the show. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Listen, I think one of the things that is the task of our generation is to break that code of silence, because I do understand why our grandparents couldn't talk about these things. I kind of understand why the trauma and the very visceral output of that trauma was still so present in our parents' lives that they hardly had any words for this, right? They were so busy trying to survive with parents that had been so severely traumatized. And, and I honestly, I don't think the trauma in the body doesn't differentiate between you having been the victim or the perpetrator. I actually think either creates such damage in our system, is so bad for us, that even if you were on the perpetrator side, the trauma is very, very real. It doesn't get any better because you were the one doing those things. I think actually on some level it's probably worse, because you have, on top of everything else, you have the guilt and you have the shame. So I think it's fantastic that you're putting on this show where you suddenly also begin to realize how many of these stories are around and how many of these stories can only be told now. So I think it's a gift that we are now of the generation that can talk about these things and can begin to open a new chapter while being very conscious of this is where we've come from.
Yeah, I've noticed in writing the books and in going into my past, it was always much easier because both my parents had already died. So it was like, I don't have to feel like I'm going to offend.
Yeah.
On the show.
And I think you're right, because in some ways that is also always a thought I have, because my mom passed away 5 years ago, but my dad is still alive. And the reason why I feel I can talk about these things is because there's nothing that I could tell you that I haven't actually addressed with him directly, right? So we had a very difficult time for a big stretch of our shared lives, and we've reached a point now where I can truly say I love him, and for what it's worth, I've forgiven him fully. And it doesn't mean that I think a lot of the choices he has made in his life were great. And at the same time, I'm also very aware that for what it's worth, I wouldn't be exactly where I'm at right now if it hadn't been for all of that, including the shit show that this family was for many years, right?
Yeah.
So there's also a clear sense of gratitude and going, well, I love who I am today. And if any little detail of that story would have been different, I would be different. I might still love who I am. I don't know, but I wouldn't be this. So
well, I love who you are. I mean, I'm doing your workshop and Andy knows me. There's not many people I would trust to do a workshop with. Like, I felt your energy. I can really surrender to it. So
thank you. That's very sweet for you to say.
When I think of your grandparents and even your parents, the word that is just vibrating is disconnected. And when people are disconnected or suppressing, it's a very explosive energy.
Yeah.
Did you? And I'm assuming you had that experience of of explosions every now and again, which can't be explained.
Exactly, which cannot be explained through the lens of a child, right? That's when they feel random and very unsafe. And, and actually, Vamos, going back to the work that you and I are now doing in CU Money, around money, this whole area of discovering the projection work, Andy, that you are also, you've also taken on as sort of the core of your work. For me, that was revolutionary, because what I realized I had pushed away and suppressed in my life very much was, for example, my inner manipulator, realizing that one of my prime survival strategies in my family was learning how to manipulate people, right? And how to manipulate them in such a way that I would always, for example, stay on the good side of my dad, because I realized my brother didn't have those skills as developed as I did, and he didn't manage to do quite the same manipulation tricks, if you want, because he was so much more volatile himself in his emotions. And he did get on my dad's bad side, and it was not a pretty picture, right? So the level of violence that he was exposed to was something that I saw, and I realized I don't want to go there. So I found ways to manipulate my father to not be exposed to that. I found ways to also manipulate my mom to get from her the kind of attention that I needed. And for me, that manipulation was, for example, often connected with playing ill, right? Because I realized as long as I functioned, my mom was more focused on her own life. And the moment I got ill and I had a headache or a tummy ache, I would get her attention. So I learned how to play ill, to realize my own level of aggression, which I had completely disowned, my own anger, and which I then had to learn, through a very painful process of self-reflection, would come out in incredibly passive-aggressive ways. Like I would be, the most gentle and most generous person to deal with until I was not, and then I would write you an outrageously angry email, and you would go, whoa, where does that come from? Like, I don't know that Nadia was A, harboring all of these emotions and feelings and observations, and B, to feel how massive that energy was that I was suddenly projecting. All of those things I had no consciousness of, and only through the process of reclaiming projections did I begin to integrate my manipulator, my perpetrator, my aggressor, all of these things that we're now talking about in the workshop as well. And it's been a huge gift, but also a very uncomfortable process in many ways, right?
No shit.
Yeah. So and I know you both can relate greatly, and I'm sort of wondering, like, what was it for you in the projection work that you felt was the edge, the thing that made you truly sweat and uncomfortable, but then brought the biggest transformation?
For me,
both of you.
I wrote it down. I'm carrying it with me because I'm reading out loud whenever I can.
I can begin before he starts. I've talked about a lot on the show is that my dad was not all that dissimilar from your dad. So he raged frequently without any reason, right? That a child could figure out at that time. So my whole life I judged anger as bad. anger was bad. Anger was bad. So everyone that was angry, I blamed them and I moved away from them. And there was a story and so on. So for me, starting to embrace that anger is good, or not necessarily good, but anger just is. And I am an angry person and that's okay. And I'm an angry person. That's fucking great. And what I noticed was that when you described the process you went through, where it would be, you'd feel the repression of the anger, then the explosion. I had that my whole life. So to make peace with anger was like, oh, there's no more explosions, because once it comes up, I'm reading the signals in my body and not suppressing, and then I'm engaging in that moment. So the reclamation for me that was really big was like, it would have started out, anger is okay. I'm an angry person. I'm just like my dad, and it's fucking great. So it had to go to like the last point of like, wow, I can't even judge him anymore. And therefore I'm just here. And now this person writes me or interacts with me, and I interact with them immediately around it. So that, because it's not suppressed, it also comes out clean. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Bambos, where are you at now?
Well, when I hear you speak, where you said that you had to pretend you were sick, or I grew up also in a kind of a violent environment, and there were times that I did pretend to be sick, or just so that I would not get an impact.
Yeah.
So, and I completely forgot about that. And when I heard you speak, I kind of relived, like, oh yeah, fuck, I did that.
Yeah.
So I was a master manipulator.
Yeah.
And
to realize also that this manipulation, I really do think those shadows that we unearth through this work, there is an element of shame that most of us experience when we first truly begin to realize, oh my God, that's me too, right? But I also think we actually need to give thanks to those parts of us that did that, because they did secure our survival. So there were basic survival strategies that, how amazing that we all had that, because otherwise we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Yeah, definitely.
Without a doubt.
And up until the point I met Andy, I never had a problem with violence, because violence is all I knew. So shouting and getting into fights was really a big part of my life. In 2014, I meet Andy in a very low part of my life, and God knows why, but he actually supported me. And he also put a boundary. He says, if you are violent in any way, this relationship is over. And I needed that. That was kind of the hard love I needed to say no to violence.
Yeah.
So I would feel the anger coming up for a long time. I would just see it coming up and I wouldn't know what to do with it. So I had to sit with it with a lot of helplessness. And now, just like Andy, if I see anger, it's like, oh, apparently there's pain here that I'm not looking at. So it's pretty much become a doorway to introspect.
Yeah.
Is that the word?
Yeah. And exactly, I think, that's the other lovely thing about becoming more conscious in, it's sort of an incremental path, right? We're nudging our way forward, and the things that used to be huge red flags at some point become nearly like friends that can point us in the right direction, right? So whereas before your anger was either completely unmoderated, or then it became the scary thing, now it's like, oh, it's a signal. I wonder what's going on, right? And then use it as a prompt to go, what is happening, right? And to really ask ourselves, what is the thing that is triggering this? And, in another podcast, I was sharing with the host that one of the ways that I developed to numb myself, because I didn't actually ever start drinking or taking drugs. There was some, very clever part in me that already said, we're not going down that path, because we've seen where that ends.
Yeah.
So that was luckily out of the question. But for me, it was developing an eating disorder, and I was bulimic for about 10 years. So the way of numbing myself was to stuff my face with food that I didn't need, and then to throw up, right? To your point of throwing up. And that was sort of a cathartic process. And at the same time, it created a lot of health issues. In the long run, it's just not a very healthy way to live your life, and also creates the same dynamic that you would have with other addictions around secrecy and trying to not let people see what I was doing and hiding it from my friends and family, and and always being busy with it in my mind. So a lot of my energy went into this addiction.
Yeah.
And what I realized as I was getting out of the addiction, there was a brief period where I had, let's say, 3 weeks without overeating, and then throwing up. And then I had a relapse. And the first reaction was, oh my God, now it's all starting again. This was all pointless. I will never get away from this. And then, it was nearly like the person trying to lose weight and sort of eating one piece of cake and then going, oh, fuck it, then I might as well eat the whole cake. Yeah. But then realizing I could look at it like that, but I could also look at it in a different way, which is I felt a much more kinder and helpful approach to say, if I have a relapse, the only function of the relapse is it's my subconscious reminding me how utterly awful stuffing my face and throwing up really is.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of reminder from my past to go, oh, you don't want to do that anymore, do you? Yeah. So, and once I had reframed it in my head as that, I actually became grateful for any of the relapses because they made it so crystal clear that this is not what I wanted anymore.
Yeah.
So I would see even anger and an outburst of anger is like, oh yeah, no, now I remember why that is so awful. I don't want that anymore. Thank you.
Yeah, that reframing is something that I do with myself, and of course when I coach individuals. So when you spoke, I could I clearly identify with it, and I think it's interesting because to some degree, there has to be, of course, the self-love component. Like I'm treating that part of the incapable part of me like a little kid, showing the love that I would to the same little kid if they were outside of me, and that's such a hard step for people to make because of all the shame and judgment, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. And, the other thing that I was sort of taking a quick note on as Vamos and you were talking in the beginning, I actually think there is a lot of trauma in high achievers, because I think another way of numbing ourselves is through working our ass off and through performing. Right. So I do think that because the clients that I usually work with, they're all, I would say 90% of them fall into this category of high achievers. They're executives. They made it very far in the world. They have all the trimmings of success, right? And when they begin to trust in this relationship that we're developing, the amount of trauma that I have seen in high achievers completely baffled me. In the beginning, I couldn't even really understand it because I had this idea that trauma would lead to the opposite in a way, right?
Oh, wow.
And I don't think that's true. I actually think these stories they're freaking everywhere, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I've mentioned it on the show a few times that if, I'll go be brought in sometimes for hiring processes, and I'll always sort of laughingly say, if you're hiring like the salesperson, not the sales director, but the salesperson, then you want someone with mommy daddy issues. Because in general, they've always got something to prove. And every quarter, if they haven't lived up to the expectation that was set, they feel like they're not going to get the love that they didn't get as a child. And it's just like over and over. And it's it's sad that quality then, it reminds me when I saw so my dad, as I mentioned, was always verbally abusive, and he was taking drugs, and sometimes he didn't. So what happened was I became a really good manager because as a young age, I was totally anticipating anything that could go wrong all the time in that fear. So humorously, I called him to thank him for all the times he was so abusive, because what I learned from that was how to anticipate things so well that I got to be very good at this function as an unconscious capacity that I, wasn't very aware of until much older age.
Well, exactly, right. And it's sort of sad until it's conscious, and then it actually really becomes a resource that you have at your disposal. And it doesn't mean that you don't use it in good ways before it is conscious, but going back to this idea of reclaiming projections, it becomes so much more powerful and be used as an intentional tool when it is a conscious choice, right? And you still have that skill set, and and you're clearly a high achiever in what you're doing, and and you have an ability to find. I would call you a truffle pig, right? That's a bit what I pride myself to be as well. A truffle pig, sort of sniffing out the best people and the best ideas, and then putting those people together. I think that's what you've done with your book. That's what you've done with A Wonderful Chaos. That's apparently how you found Bambos. So, that is now a conscious skill of yours.
Yeah, for sure.
Can I manipulate this moment and invite us just to have a deep breath in? Because
no, you can influence it, but not manipulate it.
I'm coping right now.
Well, since he's such a masterful manipulator, I would say I bow to your skills here.
We're following. Where do you want to go, Bam?
Just take a deep breath in, guys. So my body can't keep up with everything that's going on. Thank you.
So where does your body to tell you to take this?
My body is just, heart is pounding, like there's pressure. And
What's that about? I'm curious.
I guess I'm very sensitive. When people are talking, I can really feel how it impacts or how it will be to be in that situation. I can just feel it. So sometimes if I'm with people and it's very intense, I might have to go and purge for them. And I think the best way I can describe it always sometimes feels like my organs are taken up, beaten up, and put back in my body. So I'm still figuring out how to not let it stay in me, but let it move through me.
Yeah.
As you were saying or sharing that experience, I was thinking again of this ripple effect of trauma and violence, right? To even think of what happened in my family, what happened in Andy's family, what happened in your family. Like the ripples go much beyond our individual family systems, because we actually have an impact with this story every time we interact and touch another human being. Right? And that's another reason why I think it is so essential to do something with this, and to turn lemons into lemonade in order to use this trauma, this collective web of connections, and turn it into something, or tap into the beautiful potential it has. I think it has the potential anyway, but to do that consciously, and every little node of healing, every moment of connection that we're able to create because of that trauma, that creates beauty, right? And suddenly we have these nodes of light. It's like the picture that you chose for today's backdrop, right? It's a wired fence, but it could also be all of these nodes of light that are beginning to be connected and to glow together.
You're hired. From now on.
For what?
You can select the backdrops.
Well, you clearly did that, intentional, I don't know, subconsciously, who knows, but I think it's a beautiful image.
No, this was an Andy selection today.
Yeah, I was thinking Holocaust. I did my random, like, close my eyes, Holocaust, fence has to have some level of intergenerational experience of moving through it. And then I saw the bird and I said, oh, there it is, that I got it. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
When you said something earlier, I thought was very interesting. I guess it would have been 20 minutes ago even, you were speaking about the being grateful for everything that occurred before being here. And when you said that, I went back to this moment when I was sitting with my dad. We hadn't spoken in over 10 years. He threw me out and said, "You're dead. That's it. We don't talk anymore." That was the last conversation we had before we met again. And when I made peace with everything in myself, and also loved him for everything that he was and wasn't, but not in a contorted way. It was like, wow, he did this because he loved me. Wow, I love him even more now. So even the old behavior, when it came up, I actually was really loving it. It was fun to be with him, but to be a different person interacting. And as I was sitting there, I remember it was one of the last dinners we had before he died, because I didn't see him after this dinner. He said, I thanked him for basically saying you're dead and throwing me out of the house. And I didn't thank him like in this superficial, like, thank you. It's like, no, I'm really grateful for that moment, because it was that moment when I no longer had him hanging over my neck. And it was the first time I really was living. Although he wanted to fund me to be the lawyer or whatever, he would pay for any education, because that was the thing that should happen. And he needed his son to be the thing that he envisioned him to be. And that didn't happen. But what hit me so strongly was that the gratitude for him treating me by what standards would be outside as horrible was the thing I was most grateful for, because that gave me the freedom to really live my own life.
Yeah.
And I don't think before 24, I lived my own life. I was always anxious, dependent, fearful. So being tossed out, it was a different fear. It wasn't the fear of him. It was the fear of life. And that I could figure out how to manage on my own. But him, I couldn't figure out, because he obviously needed drugs to regulate his emotions. Yeah.
Well, and to that point, I think by being, to some degree, I think there's probably a point in all of our stories that if there is a person who has traumatized us in the sense that whatever behaviors and emotions they chose overwhelmed our capacity to deal with it in the moment, right? Because, talking about trauma, I think it's always also important to say that there isn't, of course, any event per se that qualifies as a traumatic event, because it's so highly subjective. It's so highly dependent on how my individual capacity is to self-regulate in the moment. And when that is overwhelmed, it might be something small to one person, but to me, it was too much.
Yeah.
And so to stay close to the person who overwhelmed our system in that way, I do think there is a moment when we do need to take a break, right? In order to to then use that chance to teach our system some new skills.
Yeah.
And healing then has occurred when you can be around that person and realize it's not overwhelming anymore. My system is now very well able to self-regulate. I can be around you and I can see you as a well-rounded person, and I don't see just this segment of you anymore. Right. Yeah. So I think a sign of healing is sort of when the wholeness comes into my perception of what this other person is. And that is a beautiful gift then that I think you were able to give your dad before he died, right? To say, actually, I can see you.
Yeah, right? I think beautiful to touch on as well, because I'd hate for anyone to watch the show and think that that's a state that's just automatically easy to get to, because it would have been 6 months earlier that he called me from a psychiatric ward wanting to speak to me, and me not knowing if he was going to survive. And I didn't take the call.
Right.
So from 6 months earlier to 6 months later, there was that profound shift. But 6 months earlier, I couldn't have taken that call, because he would have undermined my confidence for 6 months. So every time I spoke to him, I regressed back to this 13-year-old that didn't feel like self-worth. He felt insecure. He lost all of his own ability to feel just confident. So it's always important for me when I interact with people to say, wherever you are, it's actually perfect. And however much discomfort you can bring in at the time you decide, that's your prerogative. And I often see trainers think that they know what's better for their clients than they do. And that's just a dangerous game. Yeah. Let me impose on you what you should be doing, because this is the way to happiness, not seeing that each person takes their own journey, and it's your journey to hold your possibilities to hold their hand in that journey, and not push them and say, hey, you're not moving fast enough.
Yeah. There's a story in my book where I talk about nearly like a hangover effect that we can have when our penny suddenly drops, right? And and it's often a long path that we've taken, but then it's a approach, a way of seeing the world that suddenly begins to unravel an old story.
Yeah.
And when this moment hits, I think there is sometimes a part of us that is nearly angry because the part goes, well, what the hell? Like, if it's this easy, suddenly, why did we struggle for 20 years with this crap, right? Why couldn't you have seen this earlier? Why couldn't we have had this point earlier? And look at all the pain that we experienced, that we possibly caused, all the hardship. But I always use the example of saying, well, listen, but it's nearly like yelling at a 3-year-old for not being able to tie their shoelaces. Like, you just can't. Like, you're able to tie your shoelaces when you're able to tie your shoelaces, and not one moment earlier. So to have that compassion with our own process, and to go, well, the penny drops when the penny drops, right? And nobody can push you there. Nobody can tell you when the time is right, to your point. It's just something that happens when it happens. And Bambos, I was wondering what's present for you right now. I saw you're dabbing your eyes a bit with a handkerchief, and
I'm not even trying to attach anything to it. I saw that there was my tendency is to shut down when it gets too painful, so making a conscious choice just to not disconnect and stay present. But then I saw there were tears that need to come out, and I just allowed them. The alternative will be to really suppress it.
It's so sweet, this duo of yours. You're nearly like, like talking to, not to reduce any of you to these capabilities, but sort of in essence to talk to a brain and to a heart. It's like you're the constant current of emotion that is sort of being expressed. It's nearly like you're the guy that does the sign language, and while somebody is talking next to you. It's you make a very beautiful combination there.
Yeah. And I've been, it's interesting because when you were speaking, I'll work with every individual I'm with totally differently. And so with Bambos, I have to be stronger because that's the message that gets him to move. And like yesterday, I was on the show, and and it was harder on him than it didn't feel hard to me. It was just normal because that's how I know I'm going to need to engage him to sort of get the wheels turning. And Ronnie, after I went down, says, that was pretty hard on Bambos, the other day or whatever, yesterday. And I laughed because I called him afterwards. And of course we don't, because the way we work together, it's understood in the meantime.
Yeah.
And the reason why I was sharing it was connected to what the topic we just had. And was going to segue there. And now I'm forgetting what the hook was that I had in my head.
We're going to do a show called
Our Relationship.
I would love it. I think it's great. I think you're really modeling something there.
So getting to that point, I've said to Bambos, there's been times when he's really shut down, and I was like, and I started putting the zero tolerance on that. It was said, you can say it. You can say, I'm not enjoying being here. You can say whatever you want, but what you can't do is sit here silently in pain for an hour and just be present without being present. Like that was the limit. So, and there's been really nice shows. We had a week when basically all of the people, our guests, were facilitating Bambos half the time. So it was a really, and our ratings shot up through the roof. All the tears.
Peter Koenig was one of them.
Peter Koenig was one of them.
Yeah, I did watch that show. I really loved that one, by the way.
Yeah, that was a really great show. By the way, we had Bolalong. He wrote some really nice. Bolalong, he's our regular. He comes and watches, and he always makes comments. So he made one thing that there was a book that Letters of Stone from the Nazi Germans to South Africa, which is on breaking the silence of generationals before maintained. Yeah. And what I thought was quite interesting was the second comment below, which is that Bolalong, who was born Samuel Bolalong, and he couldn't make peace with his name, so he renamed himself Bolalong.
Yeah. Well, I did the Charles. I denied it.
Yeah. But he did the same. He was Samuel, and he took away Samuel.
Yeah.
It's that's quite amazing.
Well, and I think that's another part of the healing process, right? To be okay with where you've come from. And for me, that was sort of integrating. I do have a German part of the family, right? I can't just hide behind sort of the suffering of the Eastern European heritage, because there's this other side to me and my family and my roots as well, and to be in love with that today.
Yeah.
Right. So to I always thought that they maybe should have given me a German middle name or something just to sort of signify that part of my past. That didn't happen. But so I think names are very important in that picture, and coming to terms with the names that we've been given and that they have a role and a place and a part of who we are.
I have a random question that I'd like to go back to. Your grandmother had a child with the German soldier. Is that family line also family you're in contact with, or how did that stay in connection?
That did stay in connection. So my aunt, out of that, I don't know if you want to call it relationship, but at any rate, like she was the fruit of that time with the Nazi German, and she had a rough life for many years, and actually when she was 17, she left Germany and she went to the States. She lived in Hawaii for 40 years and then went to San Francisco, where she lives until this day. Wow. Had a long career with alcoholism, but pulled herself out of her own mess in her own way, and I would say today has a fulfilled life with many friends, and is in connection in particular with my aunt. So I also feel that a degree of healing has occurred there, and at the same time I can see how her life was deeply affected by that particular story. And my grandfather, I think, never managed to forgive this constant signal of this traumatic past that lived right in his house, right? Yeah. So the amount of physical abuse that my aunt endured because of being this visible signal, this symbol of the oppressor, was horrific, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. One thing that we've gone over the hour, but I'd love to point out, and it's something that it's when you mention that the emotions become signals for a deeper awareness earlier on, I've seen that learning, they call it the translation language with love, of now I'm going to look at the emotion with love and not react to that emotion. That is, I would say it's a journey, and it's also a state. The journey is how much space can you give so that you no longer attach to the emotion, and attach to it, meaning no longer see that isn't only you at that moment. And then how much love can you give it so that you see where's it coming from and what is it telling you?
Yeah.
And that journey is when I'm working with myself, and if I don't feel connected to that in myself, then I try to slow things down, because I realize it's not coming from a place of love. It's in my head trying to work out a detail that I don't understand. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
No,
I think that's a good summary.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of your time box, and come to the top of the hour.
We go over. It's just we try to. I don't know. I think we've made the assumption after an hour, who the hell is going to be still listening to us?
Right.
After the hour, it's like, now it's our time.
Get a life.
Get a life. It's like the first hour is for everybody else, and if we go over, it's like, okay, now we get our time. Yeah, it was interesting, just to follow up on that, which would be fun, is that Bambos and I had a talk yesterday.
Did we?
We had a talk today, but we started it yesterday. And maybe you can support in this with whatever insight comes, because I see that you do. Is that I'm often seeing that when I'll talk to Bambos, or when someone reflects behavior back to him, he'll think about it logically and not feel it in his body. And I realized, I think in our talk today, that I don't really think about what people say. I feel where it's true. And there's almost like trying to feel where it's true, not like, oh, is this logically right? No, I see a word they used isn't correct. And if they didn't use the right word, then it isn't matching my experience.
So yesterday I was still defending identity. And this morning I realized, oh, there's nothing to defend. So there's more like I'm experiencing a more welcoming of whatever people would give to me, a gift to explore where is it true. or where have I experienced it would better be said.
Yeah, yeah.
So thanks.
Okay.
So
Nice.
There is no
Your
question.
Oh, there was a
question,
question
or
though. The question was
Oh.
this: was something more fundamental. If you were just as an outside party in this, would you say you experience people that have more of a bodily processing of information and people that experience a head, or would you say that there's somehow they'll experience it more as a head until they can feel their body? My question is:
you mean what I would observe as sort of a pattern?
Is it unrealistic for me to expect that somebody that processes thoughts would be able to also experience it, what it felt like in their system? I'll call it their system, not even their body, but just like, oh, let me feel into that. Is that an unrealistic expectation of me?
Well, I mean, firstly, I would say, well, it's a wish that you have, right? And we can all have a lot of wishes of other people.
Yeah.
It doesn't always mean they get Peter Koenig just checked in. Hi, Peter.
Yes. Peter.
So I don't think it's always something that we can have fulfilled, of course. But I would say in terms of, of course, it's lovely when you have a person who's so fully integrated that they can hear something with all of themselves, right? And at the same time, going back to this idea that whatever strategy we've developed has probably been very important for survival at some stage. I would say if that's a pattern you might observe in Bambos, I think it's an old strategy that is apparently still useful to some degree.
Sure.
And that's okay, right? And the more integrated
Actually,
any one of us becomes,
it's fucking great.
Yeah, it's fucking great.
It's fucking great, exactly. So and at the same time, I think it's also amazing to hold people to sort of, their highest potential of what you see in them, and be a little relentless and a little annoying. And that's what I always tell my wife, right? I say, without my nagging, we wouldn't be anywhere. And to some degree, that is probably true. So I'm a nagger, and that's fantastic, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we can go out together with both of our wives, because they'll get together just fine, or you guys will get together. She's been nagging me relentlessly.
Right. They can have a complaint circle. Right?
She's getting me out of bed. Let me get your coffee.
Let
You
me
got to
take you
be
for a
on
walk.
9. Let me take you for the walk. I'm getting really managed. It's incredible. Well, Thank you for joining us. And we have another show coming up, which will be on gender and sexuality, and thinking that'll be in a few weeks or months. Bola Lang says thank you. It's always nice.
Thank you for staying along, Bola Lang. It was fantastic to have you, and Peter for a little bit. And thank you guys so much for having me on today. And I do look forward to our next conversation to see what interesting places that gets us to. Yeah,
and for those that are interested, basically I've been sending people to you that are interested in the money and the projection work, which a lot of people are now because of the book. So if people are interested in their relationship with money, and not only that, but that's the course that Bambos is now.
It goes much deeper, and
of course.
It's been really beautiful.
And Peter and you were doing it together.
So. So if they want to know any more, partly it's also what I brought up in my book, the Conscious You book, Become the Hero of Your Own Story. So that's part of the story as well. And I think there's a lot of overlap with your approach or your way of seeing the world, Andy. And if they want to know more about the money work, they can have a look at the conscious-you.com website and get all the info they need.
Put it in the comments.
Yeah, we'll put it in the comments.
Great.
Yeah, if you could, that would be great.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, you guys. See you soon.
Yes, thank you. Bye. Where am I? Did I just do that?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't even touch a button and that worked. That was incredible. Great, Bambos. Beautiful. Is that a COVID hug?
You fucker.
Tomorrow. Creeps in this petty pace from day to day.
I stopped sexual abuse with Regina.
Yeah, Regina. We talked about earlier, she does puppets. She brings puppets to school to expose sexual abuse. When the kids react to the puppets, they have a sense of who's being abused. I'm
thinking
it's an intense.
I'm thinking we're having intense.
We're having intense programs. Intense.
So
yes, it is intense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then on Friday, we've got David Boone on, who he was once homeless, and then he went to Harvard, and now he's in the high-tech industry. So we'll talk to him on Friday as well. Thank you for being with us. It was incredible having a lot of intensity this week. Love you. We'll see you next time.
Adios.
The Wonderful Chaos. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.